Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Kevin Matthews. Kevin is a former top 100 financial advisor focused on teaching the general public investing basics and how to build wealth. Today, we will speak about his new book, From Burning to Blueprint, Rebuilding Black Wall Street after a century of silence. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So, Kevin, you have a interesting background. You have been a financial advisor for many years. You achieved to be among the top 100 in the country. So that's a lot of information right there. I wonder if we could start by you telling us a little bit about your background. What is it that attracted you towards personal finance? And then we will talk about the topic of your book, which is a little bit different than personal finance.
Yeah, so I majored in economics at Hampton University, and in 2010, I got an internship to travel to New York City and work out there on Wall Street for 10 weeks. And I was a terrible intern. I was not good at my job. I didn't understand investing until like the second to last day. And I realized that if my parents had invested in the stock market, that I could have had more than $800,000 by just investing $80 a month. And I realized, like, wait a minute, how did I not know this? Like, everybody should know this type of thing. So that's why I got interested in finance. That's when I started my company, Building Bread, to teach people about investing. And that's what got me hooked. So ever since then, close to 11 years now, I've been talking about investing, teaching investing, and been in the financial space.
And when you talk about talking about investing, do you your role was mostly as a teacher, or were you selling any kind of financial products as well?
Yeah, so I started my career as a teacher. So before going into finance officially, after college, I taught seventh grade math. Then I became a financial advisor and moved to New York. But my experience is in actually investing people's money. So after a while, people would come to me. I worked at places like Citibank and Capital One. They say, look, I have $100,000. I have $1,000,000. Like, where do I put it? How do I invest it? And I was the one to solve those problems and choose those investments for them. And after a while, I said, well, at the rate that I was going, I could only talk to people who had $250,000 or more, and my parents hadn't had that level. So I wanted to leave and say I want to be able to teach people who I wanted to teach people who I thought needed it, people who didn't have money like I did growing up. So I wanted to really spread the word and starting my own company and doing that full time has been my way of doing that.
Okay, well, and then how does this transition into the topic of the book? I mean, there's a lot of history here. You are busy thinking about the stock prices and economic information, and then you decide to read this book, write this book, From Burning to Blueprint. Uh, so, yeah, how did that happen?
Yeah, so I'm from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and in 1921 we had what was called the Tulsa Race Massacre, and it was the burning of what was then called Black Wall Street. And ironically enough, I was able to go and work on Wall Street in New York City. So that was the connection there. And what happened in Tulsa was it was one of the wealthiest communities in the United States, wealthiest Black communities in the United States at that time. So I felt that writing about the history of money, the history of wealth in this country and what happened to it. And more importantly, the second half of the book talks about how to rebuild it. How do you start to invest? How do you understand stock market terms? So I wanted to talk about the history of what happened to wealth at that point in time, how to rebuild it today, and then use my financial background to show people how they can recreate it, how they can become wealthy today.
So in the book, you mentioned that you didn't even know the history of your own town, and you didn't find that out until later on. I think you were already in your 40s or something. So I wonder how come, I mean, and it seems to be a very important event in history. So how come even you living in that town didn't know about the history of your town, and how come it's not better known? Because it's a massacre, you know, there's a lot
Yeah.
of assassination there, the elimination of wealth, and the imposition of the white supremacy upon the Black men.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we've learned is that one, it wasn't something that was taught. A lot of people had not heard about it until HBO's Watchmen or some other shows that have come out. There was a Lovecraft Country on HBO just came out. And there are a lot of documentaries now in 2021 that talked about that event. But one of the reasons that I didn't know, my dad didn't know until he was in his late 30s or 40s, that the vast majority of people who live here did not know, is because we did not even build a memorial until about 1996. It happened in 1921. There was no memorial, no acknowledgement of this event until about 1996. And that just shows you the level of decimation that occurred. There were not a lot of articles after it occurred to talk about what happened to people here. More than 300 African Americans died. We still have not found those bodies to this day, 100 years later.
But why has it been erased from history? I mean, such an important event. I figure someone will be writing a book right the next year about it, and you know, historians will be fighting against each other for who has the correct version. But in the case of this community, no one was writing about it until, I don't know, 80 years later.
Yeah, there was only one book by Mariah Harris Parrish. There was one person that wrote directly after, I forget her name, but the name of the book was The Events of the Tulsa Disaster. She was the only person that wrote what was close to a firsthand account shortly after. That was it. The reason why, I mean, it's hard to tell. A lot of it is plain out racism, and in the U.S., that's the history of how racism works. But yeah, we don't know. We have no idea why it wasn't recorded or even studied until almost 80 years after.
So it's, in other words, a deliberate attempt to erase things that happen to be inconvenient for white people?
Yeah. Yeah, it was an inconvenience. Ironically enough, the state of Oklahoma just passed a law just last week that you cannot teach about race in the state. So again, that pattern of what happened 100 years ago still happens to this day.
Can you repeat that again, that you cannot teach about race?
Yeah, you cannot. Yeah, there's a ban on what's called critical race theory, which talks about the importance of race in laws and culture, and how things that you can pass can impact race. For example, in Tulsa in 1921, less than 48 hours after the massacre, the city council passed a law that you could not build a building on burned land. Well, what part of the land was burned? It was African Americans. You come down, you burn it, then you pass a law, a fire code, that you can't build here. Okay, so that's a law that had race involved. But because the state of Oklahoma now bans critical race theory, I cannot teach that in Oklahoma schools, that it was based on race, even though it was. So a lot of states are doing very similar moves, but those types of things are still occurring, that they're banning that type of education. There was nothing mandated in schools that you had to teach about the Tulsa Race Massacre up until last year. So that, again, that shows you why people don't know. It was never required. Laws are still being passed to block it and slow down that type of education. And, you know, it continues to suppress people all across the globe.
So, in other words, the only way that a U.S. citizen can find out about the historic events that happen in that city is to buy a regular book like you, which is devoted for, well, it's educational, but it's not part of the educational curriculum. So that's the only way a person can find out about those events?
Yeah, you're not, in the state of Oklahoma, you will not find it in schools at this point in time. So you got documentaries, you got my book, you got other books, but it's something that you kind of have to find out on your own, unfortunately, which is what a lot of people did in their late 20s, 30s, and 40s. So yeah, unfortunately, that's how it works.
Okay, so this town was burned. You couldn't rebuild there because by law you couldn't. So what happened to the survivors of this community? I guess they spread all over the city, the state, the country.
Yeah, so many did leave. Some went to Chicago, some went to LA, some went to Philadelphia. Others stayed and tried to rebuild. And the area of Greenwood, the Black Wall Street district, actually did rebuild a few years later. By 1923 to 1925, everything was back to normal, to some accounts. The problem, though, is that we went right into the Great Depression, and that then re-destroyed in terms of economically what we had then built. After that, they built a highway through the neighborhood, and we start to get to where we are today, where there not today, but really last year, because now they're rebuilding things today, right, to make things look good for the 100th anniversary. But prior to that, there was no real economic activity. The highway run right through that area, and things were pretty much gone.
Do you think there is certain amount of fear when Black people organize themselves economically and politically, and then it's to the advantage of the present institution to keep everyone dispersed so there would not be a significant amount of political or economical power?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that is absolutely true. The reason I say that is because we know in 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina, a very very similar thing happened. It was a majority Black town. They had Black electors from the state level and the federal level, and a very similar thing happened where they burned parts of the town. They went and took over the entire government and passed what was called the White Declaration of Independence because of the fear of Black people having power, because of the fear of Black people running the government. So it happened in Wilmington, it happened in Tulsa, it happened in Rosewood. So it is a pattern that nearly any time that you start to see significant progress, especially from African Americans, you start to see a form of resistance. Another example, we started to see the Confederate flag that we know of today. It was not a prominent symbol after World War II. It was a prominent symbol once the civil rights movement started to pass. Once you started seeing Martin Luther King, once you started to see that type of organization, that's where you saw the biggest boom in all of these statues and monuments that are popping up that people are fighting about now. That's when those things start to pop up, and that's when you start to see that resistance once you start to see Black people organized.
And actually, we don't have to go too far back in history because after the current election, there are governors and politicians trying to change the voting law on southern states. What a coincidence to restrict a Black vote.
Right, exactly. And it's always ironic. The moment that you see the biggest Black turnout ever, now there's a law against voting. Now we want to recount. Now we want to do all these things after you see record numbers from people who they don't want to vote, right? So every time that you see a resurgence in these types of things, and I think these critical race theory laws that are being banned across the board are also signs of that. Every single time you start to see significant progress from Black people and all people of color, once you start to see that, laws start to come down, rules start to come down, you start to see aggression from the other side.
Okay, so with all that knowledge, what are the plans to reconstruct Tulsa?
Yeah, so to reconstruct, there are a few things. So on the individual level, you always want to make sure, from a financial perspective, that you can do everything that you can to fortify your solitude financially. Because if you're doing a boycott, if you're going to go on a strike, you want to make sure that you have the funds, right, to last as long as you can. That's one important thing that we don't always talk about. So number one, so learning how to invest, learning how to manage your money is a part of it. But number two is what I call strategic spending. So if I spend a majority of my money, let's say at Netflix, which is a good example, I want to make sure that Netflix is aligned with me, that Netflix is going to put $100 billion, which is what they've done, into Black banks and Black causes. That makes my voice a lot louder, right? That makes people listen to me a lot more, and make sure that a billion-dollar company is going to at least, move in my direction. So where you start to see a disproportionate amount of money spent in your community in a certain area, you want to start to demand that those industries start to deposit and hire in your community and start to move and do the things that you needed to do, because you know that you are their biggest customer.
Do you suggest in any way that, okay, there is a book that came out, I think last year, it's called The Devil That You Know. And the basic idea is for Black people to try to congregate and move basically to move back south in order for them together as a bigger, as a have more political clout and maybe influence. I don't know who will be the next governor, who will be the next congressperson to represent a community. So do you think that by congregating and coming together in a particular geographical area, Black people could have a little bit more political and economical power?
That's a good point. I think there's a case to be made. I would have to read the book to be more sure, but I think Georgia is a good case study, right? That we had Georgia had two Democratic senators. One of them was African American for the first time in a long time. So I think there's a good case to be made. I think you want to be sure that you're not over concentrating where you only have one state and you only get two senators and that's it. So but I do think there's a case to be made if you were to congregate in, let's say, 4 or 5 states primarily, where you make up more of the population, that you may have some more sway. So it's interesting. I think it's something I definitely entertain.
Yeah. It's funny that after, let's say, the January 6th election, where people didn't like the outcome, they are willing to overcome government, to go and storm, like, oh, we don't like this election. This is not how we anticipated. So we are willing to destroy the constitution and the government that has been favorable to us for hundreds of years, because we didn't like the outcome of this particular election. So it's almost like destroying your nose in spite of your face.
It is a very strange event that we saw on January 6th, because you didn't get the election that you expected because people that you didn't want to vote voted, and now you're going to go and physically overturn everything. But we've also seen how those people were treated versus other protesters, right? So it's always the same pattern. And again, that exact thing happened in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, where a very similar mob came and successfully overturned the government there. I mean, we had a guy come in at that point in time and, like, by gunpoint, hold the mayor hostage and say, you're no longer the mayor. I am now. So thankfully that did not happen January 6th, but it did happen. We do have a case where that has happened in U.S. history.
Wow. Okay, so you are suggesting to have a better control of your finances. What else? Could it be a better education of politics and how your votes and your contribution to government can influence in one way or another the future of Black people?
Yeah, I think the political part of it is always going to be important. I think also paying for damages, otherwise known as reparations, is also important. And we have seen this actually happen in places. A lot of people think, well, we can't do it. It's too expensive. It'll never happen. We saw this in Rosewood in Florida, where that community was paid via education, where people were getting free tuition to state schools. We've seen it in Evanston, Illinois, just this year, where they're going to pay reparations. There's a town in North Carolina that's doing something very similar as well. So that's a part of it too. So people can actually heal. When you were to break someone's window, right, and you wait 15 years, 100 years, that window's not going to repair itself. It doesn't. That's not how things work, right? So when we have a travesty, we do have to say, look, we apologize for it, which we have not done that either. Here is how we can repair it, and then start to pass laws that benefit those communities and make sure that people have the ability to have the same footing and equal opportunity across the board.
Well, okay, so this is very useful. Okay, can you tell us what are you doing nowadays? I see that you have a website called Building Bread. What's your current job?
Yeah. So right now I run a company called Building Bread. I started this as a college junior in 2010 at Hampton University, and it's all about educating about finance, particularly investing, and making investing simple. So almost every day I'm teaching classes on how do you start investing, how do you make sure that your wealth is protected, and how do you build generational wealth. So for example, I have 2 little kids, three-year-old and an 8-month-old. How do I make sure that they are are better off than I was? How do I make sure that by the time they're 18, they can have $100,000 or $200,000, and how that can change and create generational wealth? So I teach people every day how to make investing simple, how they can do this thing for themselves, and make sure they're taking advantage of every opportunity they can have.
Wow. One last question in regards to the book. Okay, so we spoke about in all the ways in which there is still repression and discrimination. But do you think we are eventually, one way or another, tilting towards a solution? There are more and more white people who are becoming aware of these problems and the injustice that have been done in the past. and there is more diversity in the States. There is more people coming from other countries. I don't know. I guess that dilutes a little bit the white power, you may say. So you think there will be an improvement in white black relationships?
I think so. I think Martin Luther King has a quote. I'm paraphrasing here that the arc towards justice it does bend slowly. And I think we have seen some progress in those areas. And the unfortunate thing is that some areas, aka the South, are a lot more resistant to those changes than other places. And every place has issues, as well as places like New York and Chicago. But I would say yes, we are progressing. I think. Everyone, I mean everyone, would prefer this to be a much quicker process because it's been a while. African Americans have been here since from the 1619, so it's been a while. So we want to make sure that it's a lot faster. I think people are fed up of waiting close to 400 or more than 400 years.
Yeah.
So we are getting there. We do see some progress. I'm proud of the progress that we have made. We want to make sure that places like Oklahoma and others aren't passing these types of laws that are more restrictive for something that is obvious and blatant in our faces, as well as police brutality and other things. So it is trending in that direction. We just want to make sure that we're getting there a lot faster.
Wow. Okay. Well, Kevin, can we end up by you telling us one more time the title of the book and where can people follow you?
Yeah, so you can follow me on all things social media at Building Bread. You can get the book From Burning to Blueprint, Rebuilding Black Wall Street After a Century of Silence on any book platform, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and others, and hopefully in a bookstore near you.
Kevin, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it.